During a party, the millionaire proposed to his maid to save his reputation. She reluctantly accepted, but the false promises turned into vows of love. The sound of clashing glasses and artificial laughter echoed through the hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was another one of those gala parties where the elite gathered to pretend they cared about charitable causes, while in reality they were more interested in showing off expensive jewelry and making convenient connections. Cora Mitchell watched discreetly as she poured champagne for the guests. At 28, she wasn't a typical temp waitress. In fact, she had been working as a housekeeper at Alaric Rothschild's mansion for 3 years. But on that particular evening, he had insisted that she help out at the event. "I need someone I trust around," he said, without explaining why. Alaric stood out even in that crowd of important people. He was tall, well into his 35s. His brown hair was always impeccably groomed, and he wore an Armani suit that probably cost more than Cora's annual salary. She watched him walk around the room with his usual expression of superiority, greeting important people with that rehearsed smile she knew so well. "Miss Mitchell?" Alaric's deep voice surprised her. "I need you in the Winter Garden in 5 minutes." Before she could reply, he had already disappeared among the guests. Cora sighed, placed the empty tray on a side table, and headed for the indicated spot. The Winter Garden was a more private area of the museum, with huge glass windows and lots of exotic plants. It was practically empty, except for a few couples chatting in secluded corners. Alaric arrived a few minutes later, his expression more tense than usual. "I need you to marry me." Cora almost dropped the cup she was still holding. "What's it like?" "You heard me." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture that showed his nervousness. "I need to announce an engagement later this evening." "Mr. Rothschild, are you drunk?" "I've never been more sober." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "Vanity Fair magazine is publishing an article tomorrow about my questionable methods for getting the last contract with the Chinese. I need to change the narrative, and fast." Cora was beginning to understand. It was typical of Alaric to think he could control everything and everyone around him, and a sudden engagement would be the perfect distraction. "Exactly. You've known me for years. You're discreet, intelligent. It will be temporary, of course. After a few months, we'll break up amicably." "You've completely lost your mind." Cora took a step back. "I'm your maid. No one will believe it." "On the contrary." A calculating smile appeared on her lips. "It's the perfect story of the powerful CEO who falls in love with his devoted housekeeper. The press will love it, and no one will care about a few irregularities in business contracts." Cora should say no. It was the only sensible answer, but something about the vulnerability she sensed behind that arrogant facade made her hesitate. During the 3 years she had worked for him, there had been rare but significant moments when she had glimpsed a different man behind the mask of the ruthless tycoon. "What's in it for me?" The words came out before he could contain them. Apart from considerable financial compensation, the chance to be part of high society, even if only temporarily, access to opportunities you'd never have otherwise. A group of guests were approaching the Winter Garden. Alaric checked his Rolex. "I have 2 minutes before I make the announcement. Yes or no?" Cora's heart was racing. It was madness, complete insanity. But for some reason she couldn't explain. She answered, "Yes." What followed was like a hazy dream. Alaric led her back into the main hall, onto the small stage where an orchestra was playing, and asked for everyone's attention. With an Oscar-worthy performance, he announced that he had found love where he least expected it, and that his devoted housekeeper had accepted his marriage proposal. The initial silence was deafening, followed by polite applause and lots of whispering. Cora felt dozens of looks on her face, some curious, others clearly disapproving. When Alaric called her up to the stage and slid a diamond ring on her finger, where had he got that from? She had to struggle to keep a smile on her face. "Smile like you're in love," he murmured in her ear as photographers fired flashes. "I'm smiling like I've just made the biggest mistake of my life," she replied between her teeth, keeping her expression serene. The next few hours were a blur of fake congratulations and invasive questions. Cora watched Alaric in his element, weaving a convincing romantic story about how they had gradually fallen in love over the years. She just nodded and smiled, feeling more and more like an actress in a play of which she didn't know the script. It was past midnight when they finally got into the limousine that would take them back to the Rothschild mansion. Only then did Cora allow reality to hit her full force. "Tomorrow, I'll arrange the necessary documents," Alaric said, checking emails on his cell phone. "My lawyers will prepare a contract detailing all the terms of our agreement." "Agreement?" Cora laughed humorlessly. "You've just turned my life into an elaborate lie, and you talk as if it's just another one of your deals." For the first time that evening, Alaric seemed to truly look at her. "I didn't mean to complicate your life. If you want to give up, it's too late now, isn't it?" She raised her hand, looking at the ring that now weighed on her finger. "But I want to make one thing clear. I'm not one of your properties that you can control. If we're going to do this, it will be on my terms too." For a moment, something akin to admiration shone in his eyes. "Fair enough. We can discuss the details tomorrow. Right now, I suggest you get some rest. The next few days will be intense." Cora leaned her head against the tinted glass of the limousine, watching the lights of Manhattan pass by like blurs. What exactly had she gotten herself into? How had her life changed so drastically in just a few hours? What she didn't know was that that night was just the beginning of a much bigger transformation, not only in her life, but also in Alaric Rothschild's seemingly impenetrable heart. The sun had barely risen when Cora woke up startled in her room in the staff quarters of the Rothschild mansion. For a moment, she thought it was all just a bizarre dream, but the weight of the diamond ring on her left finger confirmed the reality. She was engaged to the most arrogant man in Manhattan. Her phone kept vibrating with notifications. The story was already on all the gossip sites. Magnate falls in love with housekeeper. Modern fairy tale or marketing strategy? The photos from the night before showed a Cora she hardly recognized, smiling next to Alaric as if they really were a couple in love. Miss Mitchell, the voice of Martha, the cook who had worked for the Rothschilds for decades, sounded from the other side of the door. "Mr. Rothschild, request your presence in the office in 30 minutes. Cora took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together. She dressed more carefully than usual, opting for a simple but elegant navy blue dress. After all, she could no longer look like an ordinary employee. When she arrived at the office, she found not only Alaric, but also two men in suits who introduced themselves as her lawyers. "Good morning, dear." Alaric's falsely sweet tone made her roll her eyes internally. "We need to iron out a few details of our agreement." The lawyers presented a 40-page contract detailing every aspect of the farce. Cora would receive generous financial compensation, have to attend social events, give selected interviews, and, of course, maintain absolute secrecy about the nature of the arrangement. "What about my job?" Cora asked, leafing through the document. "Obviously, you can't continue as a housekeeper," Alaric replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It would be inappropriate. I'll enroll you in etiquette and social protocol classes. You'll also need a new wardrobe and—" "Wait a minute." Cora interrupted him, something she had rarely done before. "Are you trying to turn me into one of those empty socialites who attend your parties?" The lawyers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Alaric dismissed them with a gesture, waiting until they were alone to answer. "I'm trying to make our story believable," he explained, his voice restrained. "You'll need to blend into my social circle, but completely lose who I am in the process." Cora stood up, uneasy. "That's not what I agreed to." Something changed in Alaric's expression, a flash of regret. "What do you suggest then?" "I keep up my work with underprivileged children on Saturday mornings. I continue studying to finish my degree in social work, and I choose my own clothes." To her surprise, Alaric seemed to consider her words. "Your dedication to voluntary work could be an interesting angle for the press. As for your studies, I admire your determination." The comment sounded genuine, catching Cora off guard. For a moment, she saw that other Alaric who sometimes appeared at rare moments. The man she once found crying alone in his office after his mother's death, the same one who secretly donated millions to children's hospitals. "I also want to keep my apartment," she added. "Impossible. We need to live together to keep up appearances. So I want my own floor in the mansion, the space where I can be myself, without pretenses." Alaric moved closer, studying her with a disconcerting intensity. You're different from the people I usually deal with, Cora. You don't bend easily. Maybe that's why you chose me?" An enigmatic smile appeared on his lips. Maybe. The rest of the day was a succession of appointments that Cora could barely process. Meetings with press officers, photo shoots, choosing a date for a formal engagement party. In between appointments, she watched Alaric in his element, commanding everything and everyone with surgical precision. In the evening, exhausted, Cora took refuge in the garden of the mansion. That's when her cell phone rang. It was Rachel, her best friend. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Rachel's voice was full of concern. "Have you fallen in love with him?" "Of course not," Cora replied, but something in her voice must have given away her uncertainty. "Oh my God, you're starting to have feelings for him." "Don't be ridiculous," Cora muttered in English, a habit she had when she got nervous. "It's just a business arrangement. A deal that involves living with one of the most attractive men in New York, pretending to be in love, and probably seeing him every day in intimate situations. Good luck keeping your heart protected." Rachel's words haunted her for the rest of the night, especially when, upon returning to the mansion, she found Alaric in the hallway, jacket off, shirt sleeves folded, looking more human and less like the untouchable CEO he always was. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing her troubled expression. "Just processing the changes." Alaric took a step towards her, and for a moment Cora thought he was going to touch her. Instead, he said softly, "I know I'm asking a lot. If at any point it's too much—" "I'm not one to give up easily," she interrupted him, raising her chin in defiance. The look he gave her was indescribable, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and something deeper that she couldn't decipher. "Good night, Cora." As she walked to her new room, a suite larger than her old apartment, Cora realized that she was entering a dangerous game. A game where the rules seemed to change every moment, and where her heart, no matter how hard she tried to protect it, could end up being the biggest stake. The first week as Alaric's fiancée was a roller coaster of emotions that Cora could barely process. The move to the third floor of the mansion, her new personal refuge, coincided with an avalanche of social engagements and photo shoots that made her head spin. "You need to tilt your head like this," instructed Madame Beaumont, the French etiquette instructor hired by Alaric. "And never, ever hold the champagne glass like that." Cora resisted the urge to roll her eyes as she tried to memorize dozens of seemingly meaningless rules about which fork to use first and how to sit properly. Between etiquette classes, meetings with interior designers for her new space, and endless fittings, she hardly saw Alaric except at carefully orchestrated public appearances. It was during one of these events, a charity brunch at the Plaza Hotel, that something changed. Cora was chatting to a group of socialites when she overheard one of them make a snide comment. They say she drugged his coffee for months before she managed to hook the ring. Before Cora could react, she felt a firm hand on her waist. "Ladies," Alaric's voice sounded dangerously soft. "I take it you're not talking about the woman who saved my niece from drowning last year in the mansion pool, while you were drinking mimosas oblivious to the danger." The silence that followed was absolute. The women muttered apologies and quickly dispersed. Cora looked at Alaric, surprised not only by his defense, but that he had mentioned that incident, something she didn't think he had even noticed at the time. "Do you remember that day?" she asked when they were alone. "I remember every moment," he replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "It was when I realized that there was more to you than professional efficiency." Something in the way he said it made Cora's heart race. Before she could reply, they were interrupted by a group of executives who wanted to discuss business with Alaric. That night, alone in her new room, Cora found a box on her bed. Inside was an old photo album and a note in Alaric's elegant handwriting. "To help build our history." Curious, she opened the album and felt the air escape from her lungs. They were photos from the last 3 years, moments she didn't even know had been recorded. Her serving coffee during important meetings, arranging flowers in the foyer, reading to Alaric's niece in the library. In each photo, there was something in his eyes when he looked at her that she had never noticed before. A soft knock on the door brought her out of her thoughts. It was Alaric, without his jacket, looking more casual than she was used to seeing him. "May I come in?" Cora nodded, still holding the album. How did you get all these photos? The mansion's security system records everything, he explained, stepping closer. I realized that we needed real memories to back up our story, and these are authentic. Why me? The question slipped out before he could contain it. You could have chosen anyone from high society for this role. Alaric was silent for a moment, looking out of the window that overlooked the mansion's light-filled gardens. Because you're the only person who sees me as I really am. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, just Alaric. The vulnerability in his voice caught Cora off guard. It was as if, for the first time, the masks they both wore were beginning to crack. And who are you really, Alaric? He turned to face her, his eyes revealing a depth she rarely saw. Someone who's tired of pretending. The moment was interrupted by Alaric's cell phone, a business emergency that required his immediate attention. Before leaving, however, he paused at the door. Tomorrow we have dinner with my family. They're intense, but I trust you to deal with them. After he left, Cora went back to leafing through the album, realizing that perhaps she wasn't the only one wearing a mask in that deal. The question was, what would happen when they all finally fell off? Her thoughts were interrupted by a message from Rachel. I saw you two at brunch today. Either you deserve an Oscar, or there's something real going on there. Cora didn't reply. How could she explain something that even she didn't understand? How could she describe the way her heart raced when Alaric let his guard down? Or how she began to yearn for moments like that, where she caught a glimpse of the man behind the empire? Lying in her new king-size bed, Cora realized she was entering dangerous territory. What had started out as a business deal was slowly turning into something more complex, more profound. And what was worse, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop this transformation. The reflection of the moon in the mansion's gardens cast mysterious shadows in her room, like a foretaste of what was to come. Tomorrow she would face Alaric's family, another test in her elaborate farce. But as sleep enveloped her, Cora wondered, how much longer could they keep up appearances before the truth, whatever it was, came out? Dinner with the Rothschild family was scheduled for 7 in the evening at the exclusive Lou Bernardin restaurant in the heart of Manhattan. Cora nervously adjusted her emerald green dress as the limousine approached the venue. Alaric, sitting next to her, noticed her unease and, surprisingly, put his hand on hers. My family can be challenging, he said softly, but you're stronger than them. The intimacy of the gesture and the sincerity in his voice made Cora's heart skip a beat. Over the last few days, these moments of vulnerability between them had been becoming more frequent, and that scared her more than any family confrontation she might face. The maitre d' led them to a private room where 3 people were already waiting for them. Alexandra Rothschild, Alaric's eldest sister, her husband Richard Sterling, and Eleanor Rothschild, the family matriarch. The tension was palpable in the air. So this is the housekeeper? Eleanor examined Cora from head to toe with her piercing blue eyes, so similar to those of her son. My fiancé, Alaric corrected firmly, pulling out the chair for Cora. Of course, dear. As you wish. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, did you always aim to marry a rich man? Or was that just a happy accident? Mother, Alexandra warned. But Cora was already prepared. Actually, Mrs. Rothschild, my goal has always been to make a difference in people's lives. That's why I do volunteer work with underprivileged children, and I'm finishing my degree in social work. The fact that I fell in love with your son was… She looked at Alaric, surprised by the intensity with which he looked at her, unexpected. A momentary silence fell over the table. It was Richard who broke it. Well, that explains why Lily talks about you so much. Our daughter keeps mentioning how Aunt Cora saved her in the pool. Ah yes, the swimming pool incident, Eleanor commented, taking a sip of wine. Rather convenient, isn't it? What exactly are you implying, Mother? Alaric's voice had a warning tone that Cora had never heard before. Just that it's curious how a simple governess managed to infiltrate our lives so perfectly. First saving Lily, then winning her trust, and now… Eleanor gestured dismissively. Enough. Alaric stood up abruptly. I won't allow you to insult the woman I love. The vehemence in his voice surprised everyone, including Cora. She could see that it wasn't just acting. There was genuine anger there, a protectiveness that went beyond their agreement. "Alaric, please." Cora touched his arm gently. "It's all right." He sat down, but his posture remained tense. The rest of dinner passed in an uncomfortable mixture of superficial conversations and veiled jabs. Alexandra tried to lighten the mood by telling stories about her childhood with Alaric, while Richard asked genuinely interested questions about Cora's volunteer work. When they finally left the restaurant, Cora felt as if she had been through a battle. In the car, Alaric remained silent for several minutes before speaking. "I'm sorry for her behavior. There's no need to apologize. I understand her concern. In a way." Cora hesitated. "She's right to be suspicious." "No." Alaric turned to face her. "She's wrong about you. Completely wrong." The intensity in his gaze made Cora look away. "Alaric, this is just an agreement, remember? You don't have to defend me so vigorously. What if it's not just a deal?" His words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Before Cora could answer, Alaric's cell phone rang. It was his press officer. Apparently, a former employee was threatening to leak information about the real reason for the sudden engagement. "I'll take care of it tomorrow," Alaric said, ending the call with visible irritation. But Cora could feel the weight of reality settling back between them. As much as there had been moments of genuine connection, as much as something real seemed to be growing, it had all started with a lie. Back at the mansion, when Alaric accompanied her to her floor, there was a moment of hesitation. "Despite everything, you were amazing today," he said softly. "I only did my part in the deal," Cora replied, but her voice betrayed the uncertainty she felt. "No, you did much more than that." He took a step towards her, raising his hand as if to touch her face, but stopped in mid-gesture. "Good night, Cora." Alone in her room, Cora found herself replaying every moment of the evening. Not Eleanor's taunts or the threats to her farce, but Alaric's small gestures, the way he defended her, the near touch that still made her skin tingle with anticipation. Rachel was right. Keeping her heart protected was becoming an increasingly difficult task. And the worst part was that a part of her that was growing every day wasn't sure she wanted to keep trying. The headline in the New York Post jumped off Cora's laptop screen like a slap. "Former employee alleges fraud in novel of the year." Sitting in her makeshift office on the third floor of the mansion, she tried to ignore the feeling of nausea growing in her stomach. The last few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, and now everything was threatening to fall apart. "Have you seen the news?" Alaric entered without knocking, something that was becoming a disturbing habit. His hair was messy, the sleeves of his shirt folded up to his elbows, clear signs that he had spent the night in bed. "Hard to miss when your name is everywhere," Cora replied, closing her laptop. "What are we going to do?" "I've already taken care of that. My lawyers are suing Thompson for defamation." Alaric approached, leaning on her desk. "But we need to be more convincing in public." "More convincing?" Cora arched an eyebrow. "After your performance at the dinner with your family, I thought we were already at Broadway level." A reluctant smile appeared on his lips. "That wasn't a performance." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken possibilities. Cora stood up, needing to create physical distance between them to maintain mental clarity. "Alaric, we can't." "Can't what?" He followed her to the window. "Admit that this is no longer just an agreement?" "Stop." The word came out stronger than she had intended. "You can't do that. You can't keep giving me hope when we both know it's over." Before he could reply, they were interrupted by Martha, announcing that the Vogue team had arrived for the interview and photo shoot. The next few hours were a whirlwind of flashes, invasive questions, and rehearsed poses. The reporter, a shrewd-looking woman called Vivian Chun, seemed determined to find fault with her story. "So, Cora, what's the transition like from employee to fiancé?" Vivian asked, her tape recorder cocked like a gun. "Natural," Cora replied, surprising herself with the honesty in her voice. "When you really get to know someone, titles and social positions become irrelevant." Alaric, sitting next to her on the vintage sofa in the library, intertwined his fingers with hers. The gesture seemed so natural now, so familiar, that Cora almost forgot it was part of the act. "And you, Mr. Rothschild? What does your family think of this unusual romance?" "My family?" Alaric began, his voice acquiring that protective tone that Cora was getting to know well, is learning that true happiness rarely follows social conventions. After the interview, as the team began setting up the equipment, Vivian approached Cora discreetly. You know, I started out skeptical about the two of you, but there's something there, something real. The journalist's words echoed in Cora's mind for the rest of the day. During dinner, served on the terrace under the Manhattan stars, she watched Alaric answering emails on his cell phone, completely absorbed. How had he gotten here? How had he allowed the line between reality and pretense to become so blurred? Penny for your thoughts? Alaric asked, finally putting the phone away. I was thinking about how everything has changed, she admitted. Sometimes I wake up and don't recognize my own life. Change isn't always bad. Not when it's real. Cora placed her napkin on the table and stood up. But none of this is real, is it? It's all an elaborate production to save your reputation. Alaric followed her to the balustrade of the terrace. Are you sure about that? Because the last time I checked, business contracts don't include a racing heart or sweaty hands when I'm around you. Cora felt her own heart leap. Don't do that. Do what? Tell the truth? He took a step towards her. Because the truth is, Cora, that this agreement is turning into something that neither of us planned. And that scares you, she whispered. More than any negotiation I've ever done. The moment was interrupted by the sound of heels on marble. Alexandra appeared on the terrace, her face tense. Alaric, we need to talk. It's about Mom. She's planning something. The spell was broken. Cora took the opportunity to leave, her heart pounding wildly. In her room, she found a message from Rachel. I just saw the pictures of you on page 6. Nobody's that good an actor, darling. Lying on her bed, Cora stared at the ornate ceiling, thinking about how her life had turned into an overly complex romantic movie. The problem is that in movies, love always triumphs over social differences and lies. In real life, especially when billions of dollars and reputations were at stake, things were rarely so simple. The news hit like a bombshell the next morning. Eleanor Rothschild had given an exclusive interview to People magazine, insinuating that her son's relationship with Cora was an elaborate hoax designed to divert media attention away from the problems in the family business. My son has always been brilliant in business, the article said, but naive when it comes to his heart. I'm afraid he's being manipulated by someone who saw an opportunity for social advancement. Cora was in the mansion's private gym, running on the treadmill as if she could run away from her problems, when Alaric burst through the door, his expression darker than usual. I've seen the article, she said before he could speak, slowing down the treadmill. Your mother certainly knows how to strike a blow. All sorted out. Alaric's jaw was tense. She's overstepped all boundaries. How? Cora reached for her towel, wiping the sweat from her face. By telling the truth? The silence that followed was deafening. Alaric stepped closer, his intense gaze fixed on her. It's not the truth anymore, and you know it. I don't know what's true or false anymore, Alaric. Cora felt her voice falter. We're so caught up in this farce that sometimes I catch myself believing it. What if it's not a hoax? He took another step towards her. What if all this has turned into something real? Cora's heart raced, and it wasn't from running. We can't. Why not? Alaric interrupted her, his voice heavy with emotion. Because I come from a rich family? Because we started this as a deal? Or because you're afraid? All those reasons. Cora exploded, tears threatening to fall. And mainly because the moment your reputation crisis passes, you'll realize that a governess doesn't suit your world. Before he could reply, Alexandra rushed into the gym. The reporters are surrounding the mansion. Mom's story has become a media circus. The intimate moment dissipated like smoke. Alaric immediately returned to his professional posture, starting to make calls and organize a response strategy. Cora took the opportunity to escape to her room, where she found dozens of missed messages and calls, including several from Rachel. We need to talk, said the last message from her friend. I'm worried about you. Cora agreed to meet her for coffee at a small bistro on the Upper West Side, away from the eyes of the media. Rachel was waiting for her with a worried expression. You're in love with him, was not a question. Cora stirred her coffee without sugar, avoiding her friend's gaze. It's complicated. Love usually is, Rachel replied softly. But what worries me is that you could get really hurt in this story. I'm already hurt, Cora admitted for the first time, even to herself, because every moment I spend with him, every gesture of affection or deeper look, could just be part of the act. Or it could be real, Rachel suggested. Have you considered that he might also be struggling with real feelings? The conversation was interrupted by Cora's cell phone was Alexandra. You need to go back now. Alaric is, well, you need to see for yourself. When Cora returned to the mansion, she found Alaric in his study, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table. He had just had a heated argument with Eleanor over the phone. Have you been drinking? Cora asked, concerned. Not enough. He laughed humorlessly. You know what's ironic? I've spent my whole life trying to prove my worth to her, and the moment I find something genuinely important, she tries to destroy it. Alaric, Cora approached hesitantly. No, he held up his hand, preventing her from coming any closer. I have to say, while I still have the courage, this deal, this farce, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it made me see what had been right in front of me for the last 3 years. Cora's heart seemed to want to jump out of her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that I fell in love with the woman who organizes my library alphabetically and by color, who scolds the gardeners when they mistreat the roses, who still wears that cheap lavender perfume even though she has access to the best French perfumes. He stood up and walked towards her. I've fallen in love with you, Cora, and it terrifies me completely. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Cora could hear her own heart beating in her ears, feel the warmth emanating from Alaric's body so close to her own. Is that the drink talking? She whispered. That's the truth talking, he replied, his gaze more sincere than she had ever seen it. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Alaric's confession hung in the air like a storm about to break. Cora could feel the weight of those words, the vulnerability in his normally controlled eyes. Before she could reply, his cell phone rang again. This time it was his press officer with urgent news. Fox News wants a live interview. Now. Alaric ran a hand through his hair in frustration. They're threatening to bring my mother on the show if we refuse. You're in no condition to give an interview, Cora said firmly, taking the glass of whiskey from his hand. Let me go. No, he protested. I'm not going to let you face this alone. But I won't be alone, she replied, surprising them both with her determination. Because what you said about your feelings, I feel the same way. The look Alaric gave her was a mixture of hope and fear. Cora, but first we need to deal with this, she interrupted him gently. I'll have a quick shower and change. In 30 minutes we can be at the studio. An hour later, they were in the Fox News studios in Manhattan, preparing for a live interview on the most-watched program in prime time. Cora wore a navy blue dress that Alexandra had insisted she buy weeks ago, while Alaric, now more sober and composed, wore his usual impeccable suit. Remember, the press officer instructed. Maintain eye contact, show natural but not exaggerated affection, and if they ask about Mrs. Rothschild, leave it to me, Cora interrupted him, surprising everyone with her confidence. The interview began with the expected questions about how they met and when they realized it was love, but soon the presenter, a woman with a sharp smile called Melanie Porter, went on the attack. Ms. Mitchell, how do you respond to the accusations that this relationship is just a PR strategy? Cora felt Alaric's hand squeeze hers lightly. It was now or never. You know, Melanie, she began, her voice calm but firm. When I first started working for Alaric, he was just the arrogant CEO who barely noticed the people around him. But then I saw how he secretly paid for the medical treatment of employees in need, how he spent sleepless nights working on clean energy projects, how he cried alone when he lost his mother. Alaric looked at her intensely, clearly surprised by her words. What about him? Melanie pressed. What did he see in you apart from an employee? Someone who wasn't afraid to say no, Alaric replied, without taking his eyes off Cora. Someone who challenged me to be better, who saw beyond my bank account, who showed me that true wealth has nothing to do with money. What about your mother's statements, Mr. Rothschild? My mother, Alaric took a deep breath, is hurt because, for the first time, I chose to follow my heart rather than her expectations. But I hope that one day she'll understand that true love doesn't follow social rules. The interview continued, but something had changed. It was no longer a rehearsed performance. It was the raw, vulnerable truth of two hearts finally finding the courage to open up. Later, in the car returning to the mansion, a silence filled with meaning filled the space between them. It was Cora who finally spoke. Every word I said was true, even the bit about the arrogant CEO. Alaric smiled, but his eyes were serious, especially that part. She laughed softly. But you've changed. Or maybe I just started to see who you really were. You changed me, he admitted, turning to face her. And now I don't know how to go back. Who says we have to go back? The car stopped in front of the mansion, but neither of them made a move to get out. On the horizon, the lights of Manhattan shone like thousands of earthly stars, silent witnesses to a moment that would change everything. What now? Cora asked, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Now, Alaric replied, leaning towards her, we stop pretending. There was nothing stagey about the kiss that followed. It was real, deep, and full of all the feelings they had both repressed for so long. When they broke apart, panting, Cora saw in his eyes the same mixture of fear and hope that she felt. That complicates everything, she whispered. Or simplifies it, he replied. Because now we're no longer following a script. We're just being ourselves. The sound of photographic flashes brought them back to reality. Some paparazzi had managed to infiltrate the grounds of the mansion, but this time, neither Cora nor Alaric cared about the photos, because what they would capture would no longer be a hoax, but the start of something genuine and frighteningly real. Martha was waiting for them at the door with a worried expression. Mr. Rothschild, your mother is in the library, and she's not alone. The library of the Rothschild mansion, normally a sanctuary of tranquility, was electrified with tension. Eleanor Rothschild wasn't alone. Next to her was Bernard Thompson, the former employee who had threatened to expose the truth about the engagement, and a man Cora recognized as Victor Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal. What a lovely surprise, Eleanor said, her smile as cold as Manhattan ice. We've just watched your moving performance on TV. Mom, Alaric began, his voice controlled but tense. What does that mean? It means, darling, that it's time to end this farce. Eleanor gestured to Victor. Mr. Hayes is prepared to publish a full story about how you manipulated the media and the market with that fake novel. Cora felt Alaric's arm stiffen at his side, but before he could respond, she stepped forward. Mrs. Rothschild, Cora spoke up, surprising everyone with her calmness. Have you ever stopped to think why your son had to create this situation in the first place? Eleanor blinked, momentarily baffled. How dare you? I dare because someone needs to tell the truth. Cora continued, her voice gaining strength. Your son has spent his whole life trying to achieve impossible standards. He built an empire, revolutionized entire industries, but nothing was ever enough for you. Cora, Alaric tried to intervene, but she gently touched his arm, asking for silence. Yes, we started this as an agreement, but you know what happened? We discovered that sometimes the best love stories start in the most unexpected ways. She turned to Victor Hayes. Want a story? How about this? How the most powerful man in Manhattan found true love just when he was trying to manufacture it? The silence that followed was deafening. Victor Hayes looked from Cora to Alaric with renewed interest, his journalistic instincts clearly sniffing out a different angle. Fascinating, he muttered, closing his notebook. Mrs. Rothschild, I think we have a much more interesting story than we initially thought. You can't be serious, Eleanor protested. On the contrary, Victor smiled. A love story that transcends social classes, starting as a business deal and turning into something real. That's the kind of narrative our readers love. Bernard Thompson, who had remained silent until then, sniffed uncomfortably. Maybe I've misinterpreted things. Alaric finally found his voice, but he was no longer the calculating CEO talking. He was just a hurt son. Why, Mom? Why is it so hard to accept that I may have found happiness in a way that you didn't plan? Because she's not like us, Eleanor replied, her mask of composure finally cracking. "Because I'm afraid she'll break your heart, or worse, that she'll take you away from everything we've built." "You're doing exactly that right now," Alaric replied softly. "And for the first time in my life, I'm choosing to be happy over being perfect." Victor Hayes stood up, putting his notes away. "I'll let you sort it out as a family. But if I may give you some professional advice, sometimes the best stories are the ones that surprise you." After Victor and Bernard left, the silence in the library was as heavy as lead. Eleanor seemed smaller somehow, her proud posture finally giving way. "Do you really love her?" she asked Alaric, her voice almost a whisper. "More than any contract, merger, or acquisition I've ever made," he replied, entwining his fingers with Cora's. "And if you can't accept that, then maybe it's time we redefined our relationship too." The first tears Cora had ever seen shone in Eleanor's eyes. "You're just like your father. He too always followed his heart, no matter what I said. And he was happy about it," Alaric replied softly. Eleanor stood up, adjusting her posture. I need time to process all this." As she left the library, Cora and Alaric stood in silence for a few moments, letting the weight of events settle. "You were amazing," Alaric finally said, pulling her into his arms. "I was terrified," Cora admitted, resting her head on his chest. "But I realized that some things are worth the fear. Like us." "Like us?" The kiss they shared then was different from the previous ones. There was no more fear or hesitation, just the certainty that, whatever obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together. Alexandra found them like this, an hour later, still in the library. "The tabloids are going crazy over the photos of you kissing in the lobby. And apparently the Wall Street Journal is going to publish a special article on the true romance of the century. Let them publish it," Alaric replied, without letting go of Cora's hand. "For once, we have nothing to hide." That night, while the city that never sleeps shone outside, Cora realized that sometimes the best fairy tales aren't those that begin with "once upon a time," but those that are born out of the most unlikely situations and grow, like the roses in the mansion garden, even in the midst of adversity. The headline in the Wall Street Journal made the expected impact. From agreement to true love, the story behind the Rothschild romance. Victor Hayes' article was surprisingly compassionate, portraying Alaric and Cora as a couple who found genuine love in the most unlikely circumstances. "It's strange to see our story told like this," Cora commented, leafing through the paper over breakfast on the mansion's veranda, "as if it were a modern fairy tale." "Does it bother you?" Alaric asked, watching her over his coffee cup. "It's not that. It's just that." She hesitated, choosing her words. "Part of me still hopes to wake up and discover that it was all an elaborate dream." Before Alaric could reply, Martha rushed in with an envelope in her hands. "Ms. Mitchell, this just arrived for you. It's from the Bronx Community Center." Cora opened the envelope with trembling fingers. It was the response to her application for the position of Director of Social Programs, a position she had applied for weeks before, when everything was still just an agreement. "They want to hire me," she whispered, rereading the letter. "They want me to develop programs for at-risk children." "That's wonderful." Alaric smiled, but then noticed her conflicted expression. "Isn't it? It's a full-time job. In the Bronx. It means I won't be able to keep up the social appearances that your position requires." Cora placed the letter on the table. "And your mother will probably see that as proof that I don't belong in your world." "My world?" Alaric stood up, walking over to her. "Cora, you've transformed my world. Before you, it was all about profits and acquisitions. Now," he took her hands between his, "now I know there are much more valuable things." The moment was interrupted by Alaric's cell phone. It was Eleanor asking to meet them for lunch at Lou Bernardi, the same restaurant where everything had almost fallen apart a few days earlier. "We don't have to go," Alaric offered, but Cora shook her head. "Yes, we do. We can't build a future while there are so many unresolved issues." Lou Bernardine was quiet for a Thursday lunch. Eleanor was already waiting for them at a discreet table at the back, looking more vulnerable than Cora had ever seen her. "Thank you for coming," she said as they sat down. "I've spent the last few days reflecting a lot on my actions." "Mother," Alaric began, but Eleanor held up her hand. asking him to continue. When your father died, I promised myself that I would do everything to protect you and our legacy. But in the process, I forgot to protect something much more important, your happiness. She turned to Cora. I saw how you defended him that night in the library. I saw the strength in you, not just to stand up to a prejudiced society, but to see beyond the mask my son wears to the world. Cora felt tears forming in her eyes. I just see him as he really is. And that's exactly what he's always needed, Eleanor smiled sadly. Someone who loves him not for the empire he's built, but for the man he is. So you, Alaric hesitated, his voice breaking, give you my blessing? Yes. Eleanor took something from her bag, a small old photo album. Actually, I brought something for you. The photo showed a young couple, Eleanor and Alaric's father, in everyday situations, smiling, clearly in love. His father was an accountant when we met, she explained. My family was against our relationship, but he had big dreams and an even bigger heart. Like Alaric, Cora whispered. Like Alaric, Eleanor agreed. And like him, he chose to follow his heart even when everyone said it was crazy. Lunch continued with stories of the past, laughter, and a few tears. When Eleanor mentioned the job offer Cora had received, her reaction surprised everyone. The Bronx Community Center, I know their work. In fact, the Rothschild Foundation could establish an interesting partnership. Mom, Alaric interrupted, smiling. Let Cora build it herself. She's perfectly capable. Yes, she is, Eleanor agreed, looking at Cora with new respect. As they left the restaurant, Cora felt as light as she had in a long time. Alaric intertwined his fingers with hers as they walked through Central Park. So, he said softly, will the director of social programs have dinner with an arrogant CEO tonight? Cora laughed, stopping to stare at him. Does the CEO in question understand that I'm going to come home late every day, probably covered in gouache paint and with endless stories about the children? As long as those stories are told in our bed, with you in my arms, he replied, pulling her into a kiss that made some nearby tourists cheer. On the horizon, the sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Cora thought about how her life had changed since that night at the gala party, how a business deal had turned into something so deeply real that it sometimes hurt. What are you thinking about? Alaric asked, noticing her distant gaze. About how sometimes the best plans are the ones that go wrong the right way. Autumn tinted Central Park in golden hues when Cora woke up in her new room at the Rothschild mansion, no longer in the staff quarters, but in the master suite she now shared with Alaric. 6 months had passed since that night in the Metropolitan's Winter Garden, and her life had changed in ways she had never imagined possible. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from Rachel. Ready for the big day? Today would be her first official presentation as Director of Social Programs at the Bronx Community Center. After 3 months in the position, she would finally present her expansion project to the board, an ambitious program that would include not only assistance for the children, but also job training for their parents. Nervous? Alaric's voice sounded from the closet door, where he was adjusting his tie. Even after all this time, seeing him disheveled in the morning still made her heart leap. A little, she admitted, standing up, but it's a good kind of nervous. You're going to rock it, he smiled, coming up to kiss her, just like you rocked it last night at the Foundation's gala dinner. The dinner had been his first major public appearance since the truth about the start of their relationship had come out. To everyone's surprise, especially Eleanor's, the real story only increased the public's fascination. As Victor Hayes had predicted, people loved the idea of a love that grew naturally out of artificial circumstances. Speaking of kicking ass, Cora commented, helping him with his tie. I saw the figures for Rothschild Corporation's new clean energy initiative. All thanks to your suggestion of partnering with underprivileged communities, Alaric replied, his eyes shining with pride. Who knew that installing solar panels in public schools would not only be socially responsible, but also highly profitable? Your mother was certainly impressed, Cora laughed, remembering Eleanor's expression when the results were presented at the last board meeting. Speaking of her, Alaric hesitated for a moment. She wants to meet us for dinner tonight. She said she has a surprise. Before Cora could reply, Martha knocked on the door, announcing that breakfast was served and that Alexandra had arrived early to discuss the last details of the wedding. Yes, the wedding, no longer a farce to save reputations, but a genuine celebration scheduled for the following spring. Alexandra had appointed herself official planner, turning every decision into a dramatic event in itself. "You can't have an ordinary wedding," she declared as she attacked her pancakes. "We need to incorporate elements of your history. Please tell me you're not planning to recreate the Winter Garden scene," Cora groaned, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Better," Alexander smiled mischievously. "I'm thinking of having the reception at the Metropolitan Museum, the same place where it all began, but this time without the need for pretenses." Alaric watched the two interact with a smile on his face. It was amazing how his sister, who had initially been so skeptical about their relationship, was now one of the biggest supporters of their love. "I have to go," Cora announced, checking her watch. "The children are performing a play today before my meeting with the board." "I'll drive you," Alaric offered, getting up. "I have a meeting downtown later anyway." In the car, as they drove through the city, Cora observed the profile of the man next to her, how he had changed in recent months, not just in his way of doing business, but in small gestures that showed a heart that had always been there, just waiting for the opportunity to reveal itself. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, taking her hand. "About how sometimes we need a lie to find our greatest truth." The community center was decorated with drawings and posters made by the children. When Cora entered, she was greeted by hugs and excited smiles. Alaric watched her interact with the little ones, his heart filling at the sight of the woman who had transformed not only his life, but the lives of so many others. Mr. Rothschild, Billy, one of the shyest boys in the program, ran up to him. "Mrs. Mitchell said you were going to see our play." "I wouldn't miss it," Alaric smiled, bending down to meet the boy. The children's performance of a creative adaptation of Robin Hood was followed by enthusiastic applause. When Cora took to the small, makeshift stage to make her speech to the board, her eyes met Alaric's in the audience, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Sometimes, she began, the greatest transformations begin with small acts of courage. Later, at dinner with Eleanor at Le Bernardin, the surprise was revealed. She was donating a significant part of her personal fortune to establish a foundation dedicated to educational programs in underprivileged communities. "And I want you, Cora, to be the chairman of the board," Eleanor announced, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "Because you taught me that true wealth lies not in preserving a legacy, but in creating a new one." That night, lying in Alaric's arms in their king-size bed, Cora thought about how life had curious ways of guiding us exactly where we needed to be. "You know what's funny?" she murmured sleepily. "If you hadn't had that scandal with the Chinese—" "Shoo," Alaric interrupted her with a kiss. "Some stories are better when they start in the middle." And he was right, because in the end, it didn't matter how they had started, it mattered that they had found, in the midst of an elaborate lie, the deepest of truths, that true love doesn't follow scripts or social expectations. Sometimes it just happens, turning agreements into destiny and strangers into soul mates.